Hello, I'm Ben Wattenberg. Voters seem to be fed up with politics, but around the country, candidates for next year's election are already hard at work. Voter apathy notwithstanding, this may be a very important election. For almost 2 decades, political scientists have been speculating about a major change in the political balance of power. Are we now witnessing a stealth realignment? Joining us to sort through the conflict and the consensus are E.J. Dionne, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, Washington Post columnist and author of They Only Look Dead: Why Progressives Will Dominate the Next Political Era. Larry Sabato, professor of government at the University of Virginia and co-author of Dirty Little Secrets: The Persistence of Corruption in American Politics. And Charlie Cook, editor of The Cook Political Report. The topic before this House, the lives of the parties. This week on Think Tank. In 1992, when Bill Clinton won the presidency, he ended a 12-year Republican hold on the White House. At the time, the Democrats had solid control of the House of Representatives, the Senate, the governorships, and the state legislatures. Their joy was short-lived. In 1994, the GOP won big and held on to their gains in 1996. Here's what happened. In the House, the Republicans have won 2 consecutive majorities for the first time in 67 years. The Senate had been more closely contested, but Republicans now hold a solid lead. At the state level, there are now 32 Republican governors whose states contain roughly 3/4 of the American population, and the state legislatures have changed dramatically, away from Democratic dominance and toward Republican equality. The few important midterm races of 1997 were won by Republicans. The Democratic National Committee is deeply in debt. The pundits mostly see the Republicans doing well in 1998. Is this a random fluctuation or a stealth realignment? Charlie Cook, you are a Washington monument, one of the fabled neutral observers of elections. How about it? What's going on now?
I think there's no doubt that Democrats have lost their majority party status, and that we've now come to a point of, I think, basically equilibrium between the two parties. And we don't know what's happening next. Are Republicans going to become the new majority party? I think we're going to hold that equilibrium status for a while.
EJ.
I basically agree with that. I think you've had a real realignment in the South, in most of the old Confederate states. Florida is a special case, and that's been coming since 1964. The question is whether you're having a counter realignment toward the Democrats in the Northeast and also on the Pacific Coast. I think that the data for that are from the 1996 election. The Republicans gained 3 seats in Alabama and Mississippi, and they lost 4 seats in the House in New England. The question is, do Democrats continue to make those gains, or do the Republicans build on what they've already done in the South?
Larry, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's important, again, to point out the complexity of what's happening. There are 2 gradual rolling realignments. One is in the Northeast and Midwest and the Pacific Coast states toward the Democrats. The other, which is a stronger rolling realignment, is in the South and the West toward the Republicans. Since the population centers of the country are moving south and west, I think that gives a slight Republican tilt to the realignment.
Except for California, where in a sense that's the whole game, because if, for example, on these governorships, the Democrats have a reasonable shot, according to Charlie's analysis and a lot of other people, of getting back that governorship. If California is so central to how this will look over the next 10 years, if California continues to trend Democratic, it looks very different than if the Republicans make that state competitive again.
There are also some differences from the offices. I think we're likely to see in the next election Republicans probably pick up a seat or 2 in the Senate. I think they'll maintain a majority in the governorships as well. But at the same time, I think the House is going to be in play for the foreseeable future.
What about the state legislatures? It seems to me that state legislature trend is a powerful one. I mean, that's not just the South. That's nationwide from a very large, it was almost 2-to-1 Democratic, and it's now about 50-50.
That's the most important trend of all the ones we're talking about for the Republicans for a couple of reasons. One, legislatures tend to be the bodies that realign these House seats, that draw the new lines. And if the Republicans have a stronger voice in that, they have a better chance of holding on to the House.
This 1998 sort of election that most people seem to be ignoring particularly important, because these state legislatures and these governors will reapportion the seats for the House of Representatives. What is that
in
normally?
States with 4-year terms? In some states, as you know, they turn over in 2000, so that could still be important. But you're right. I think the next 2 elections will have a lot to do with how
but the great majority of the governorships that are of the governors elected in '98 will run through 2002. Is that right?
Right, right. There's another point, though, and that is that the legislatures are also the breeding grounds. That's where you get candidates. And if you look at the typical congressional race in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, you had an experienced local elected official, state or local elected official, who was the Democratic candidate, and you had a Republican business person who had never run for office before and had no political experience. And that's why one reason why Democrats kept winning time and time again. They had the more experienced candidates. When you have that pool of Republican state legislators out there to draw from, I think you're going to get a higher quality congressional candidate in the future for the GOP.
EJ, your book, as we mentioned in the run-up, is called "They Only Look Dead: Why Progressives Will Dominate the Next Political Era." We know that progressives is a code for the L word, for liberalism. Do you really think that, given the trends that we have shown, that liberalism is making a comeback in America?
Well, I think we can talk about 2 things. Right now, we're talking about the mechanics of elections. We can also talk about the flow of the issues in elections and what issues are going to matter. And I think what you saw in 1996 is that the Republicans thought that there was an overwhelming majority in the country for a vastly reduced federal government. This led them to believe that even popular programs like Medicare could be cut in the interest of cutting taxes. Yet in their heart of hearts, they knew this wasn't quite as popular as they were saying, because they would have said it as directly as I just did. And when the 96 elections came, you suddenly saw the Republicans saying, wait a minute, the flow of the issues isn't quite what we thought. They raised minimum wage. They passed the Kennedy-Kassebaum health bill, which was designed to help people who switch jobs keep their health insurance. I think what you're going to see in the coming elections, one of the big fights is going to be who owns the education issue. The Democrats had owned it in 1996. In the 1997 elections, particularly in Virginia, where Jim Gilmore knew the Republicans were vulnerable, the Republican who got elected, he went out and said, we're going to spend state money to put 4,000 more teachers in schools. What you're seeing there is a conservative Republican acknowledging a public need and playing to a very strong feeling in the electorate. I think another issue where you're going to see this battle for position is on child care. What I'm saying is that the array of issues is changing from a pure attack on government, cut taxes, to a situation where Republicans know it's not enough to say that, and they're trying to grab these issues that are historically seen as liberal or democratic or, if you will, progressive issues.
Is he just flannel-mouthing here because he's afraid of those lines on the chart?
Well, he's
I never flannel mouth.
He's never flannel mouth, and I agree with that. But he has to defend that thesis about progressivism. I would tend to see it a different way. I don't think all that much has changed. The ideological fulcrum of American politics has been, is now, and will be moderate conservative. The emphasis is on the word moderate. It's not hard right, and when the Republicans go hard right, they tend to lose elections. When the Democrats forget that it's moderate and not liberal or progressive or whatever you want to call it, they tend to lose elections. And what you're really arguing about, EJ, it seems to me, is the positioning. Parties simply take stands often, as Gilmore did on education, to neutralize the opposition so they can then move to territory more friendly to them, which in Gilmore's case was taxes.
Well, I agree with that, but I think that what you're seeing, when I talk about progressive, and the reason I use that word is not to evade liberal, but to go back to a tradition that goes back to Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson and moves forward, what you're seeing is a lot of Republicans, Bill Kristol, Bill Bennett, John DiIulio, David Brooks, people like that saying, look, we can't keep arguing that there is no role for government anymore. The point is, a lot of Republicans know their own rhetoric, to pick up Larry's point, was not moderate enough for the vast number of Americans who have doubts about government and its performance, but also want government to do some important things, especially involving their kids and elderly people.
I agree with both these guys.
That is your job, is to either agree with both of them or disagree
Well,
with
no,
both of
let me
them.
kind of pull something together here.
Just for our viewers, let me just say that Charles Cook and his sometime colleague and sometime competitor, Stu Rothenberg, are, as we said at the beginning of the show, sort of the Washington monuments, the fabled neutral observers who call them as they see them. Sir.
I stand in awe of your compliment.
And they both put out newsletters, which are very good.
I'll put the address up at the end. The thing is, I think EJ was right in the sense of right after the '94 election, you had some overheated rhetoric coming from a couple of dozen Republican, very conservatives, mostly out of the House, mostly younger, who sort of got their hormones out of whack or something. And they went way too far with some really inflammatory rhetoric that touched pretty close to where EJ was coming from. But I think, clearly moderate conservative, where Larry suggests is where the country is. I agree completely. What I thought was interesting is when Republicans did start moving back towards the center, that's one of the things that helped them hold on to the House of Representatives in 1996, because they had a near-death experience, and most of them know it. EJ touched on the education issue a minute ago, and I think it'll be very interesting to see who does dominate the education issue in the next couple of years. I sense that you're going to see Republicans moving away from charter schools, moving away from vouchers, and these are issues that really resonate with conservatives but just don't at all with swing voters. I think you're going to see them going towards merit pay for teachers, competency testing for teachers, tenure reform. There's a proposal in California, 95.5, that says that 95% of all education funding has to go into the classroom. Stop talking about abolishing the Department of Education. This would reduce the Department of Education down to 2 floors of an office building someplace.
You think the voucher program, when brought to voters, is unpopular?
I don't see it catching on with average voters at all. I think average voters see it as a way of undermining neighborhood schools. More than anything else, voters see the sanctity of neighborhood schools, and I think that's why these things, they just simply haven't resonated with voters.
The problem for
that is not what the polls show. The polls show a general tendency moving toward public-private school vouchers.
You don't see, I don't see voters volunteering it as a response on any questions. I don't hear voters talking about it. If you ask them, do you think this is a good idea or bad idea, maybe they say it's a good idea, but there's no buzz out there.
The paradox is that vouchers tend to be most popular, it seems, from the numbers I've looked at, among African Americans in inner city areas where the schools are broken. They tend to be unpopular, or at least they don't resonate very much with middle-class swing voters in suburbs who are not all that unhappy with their public schools. They want them better, but they don't see them as a catastrophe. Then they're worried about losing their neighborhood schools.
The nominal representatives of those inner-city African Americans are the liberal Democrats, and yet they are the ones who are most starkly opposed to school vouchers.
Well,
for inner-city African-American kids.
Well, I don't think there's any doubt about this, because the National Education Association, the teachers' unions, are adamantly opposed to it, and they are very closely aligned with the Democratic Party. That's no secret.
And those same groups give Democrats a tremendous edge on the education issue. The remarkable thing to me is how little things change over time. Democrats are identified with education and health care and concern for the elderly, and Republicans are identified with defense and being tough on crime. And these issues really don't change very much. Just the proportions of people who view each party as being close to them change. So again, when the subject is taxes or crime, Democrats have to neutralize the issue and move it toward the issues that people identify them with. And the same is true for Republicans. I don't think they'll ever lead with education. What they need to do is present enough on education so that people say, it doesn't look like there's that much of a difference.
Which Gilmore did in the Virginia race, I think, quite brilliantly, and as a model for what the Republicans are going to try to do elsewhere.
Now, Charlie, am I correct in saying that you have been saying, as this neutral observer, that the likelihood, and you've, I think, put some odds to it, 3-1, 4-1, 5-1, is that the Republicans will retain control of the House, certainly of the Senate, certainly of the governorships, even if California goes the other way. The state legislatures will remain probably very tight. Is that a correct?
Yeah, I think there's about an 85% chance that the Republicans will hold on to the House of Representatives, and that's up from maybe 75% a couple months ago.
Okay, now, if that happens, you then will have had, it seems to me, or you can make the case that what has happened in the mid-1990s is more than an anecdote. You would have the '94 elections, the 96 elections, the 98 elections, let's assume they come out the way Charlie suggests. Is it then overstepping the bounds to say that's the way the country's moving? After all, these are institutions that have a certain momentum and life of their own. I mean, can we say that there is, assuming 1998 plays out as we think, that this is a movement toward that long-awaited realignment toward a more conservative government?
Let me say, I think so, but I would say the real test is the next time we have a Republican president. And once you have a two-term Republican president, can the Republicans hold on to one or both houses of Congress? Will they continue to have a majority of the governorships? Because while I agree with your basic thesis, the one factor I don't think you're taking into account. Yes, I think you. I know you're neutral too. Yeah, you're neutral too.
I call myself the immoderator.
Right. But over time, I think that people increasingly want to see divided government. They don't trust. They don't have the party ID they once did. They don't trust Democrats or Republicans fully. They like to have the two parties checking one another. So partly the Republicans have done so well gubernatorially and congressionally because Bill Clinton is president. But what happens the next time we have a Republican president for 2 terms? That will tell the tale.
How important is the campaign finance situation? Not the issue of reforming campaign finance, but the fact that for the moment it seems that the Republicans will be much better financed now and in the future.
I think that's going to be hugely important to the Republicans in '98 because you're not only going to have
and to the Democrats,
Republicans, I mean, it's a big plus for the Republicans. You're not only going to have the parties themselves better financed, but the Republican interest groups, especially the business groups, I think are going to look at what Labor did in 1996. Then Labor did some real damage to the Republicans in the Northeast and Midwest. And they're going to say they're going to be there earlier than they were the last time. You're going to have an explosion of all of this, if you will, unaccountable money going into these independent campaigns.
Now, Charlie, how important is it? After all, most people running for office in America do not get their monies from the national committees. They raise these are mom and pop shops, is that right? So if the Republican National Committee has a lot more money than the Democratic National Committee, how important is that?
We saw in the off-year elections this year, 97, about, in terms of national party, about a 5-to-1 ratio of Republican to Democratic money. And it basically took a congressional seat, New York 13 on Staten Island, that was leaning towards the Republican side, probably would have gone that way, but was definitely in play, and just completely cinched it up, turned it into a landslide. And in New Jersey, where Christy Todd Whitman was just fighting for her life, I think it helped make a bit of a difference there. Now, next year, I don't think it's going to be a 5-to-1 ratio, but it's still going to be a very big number. It will give Republicans a big edge.
Is that 5-to-1 in the amount of the spending of
the
national
party
committees?
Money coming into those states or districts?
But what percentage of a candidate's expenditures in a normal situation come from national committee sources, and what percentages do they go out and beg, borrow, and
17
steal?
On the Republican side and under 10 on Democratic side.
The national monies. So you could still have an overwhelming Republican financial edge nationally, and all of us talking about the DNC debt and illegal campaign finance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and the actual expenditures between the two candidates.
Right, but what's key is the expenditures that aren't made by the two candidates. One of the reasons the Republicans did so well in Staten Island is they were in a whole so-called independent campaign against the Democrat, running lots of ads. I think it was $700,000 worth, something like that, saying this guy's a big taxer. He was actually a very conservative Democrat, but that had an effect. So that I don't think you can measure competitiveness anymore just by looking at what the candidates themselves do.
There's one other thing that happened, and that is after Republicans took control of the House in 1994, or Congress in 1994, in the House of Representatives, you saw a huge decrease in the amount of money from business PACs going to Democratic candidates. Where Republicans already had an edge, but it practically evaporated. Now you saw labor money pick up, but labor did not pick up nearly as much as business dropped. And that's helped build this imbalance between the two parties.
This is part of what I was talking about before, this momentum effect in American politics. If you win in 94 and you win in 96 and you win in 98, that's where the money starts going. That's where the committee chairmanships are. That's who reapportions the Congress, and it tends to take on a life of its own.
There's one other factor that will support your thesis for 1998. we're going to have an incredibly low turnout in '98, and that's what all the '97 elections have told us. And when you have a low turnout in these conditions, it means that people who make very high incomes are a disproportionate group in the electorate, and they're very Republican. And secondly is the money situation. I just don't see it getting any better for Democrats. It's likely to get worse, maybe much worse. You add money to turnout, and the 6th year of a presidency, even in good economic times, and I'll bet you we're underestimating Republican gains.
But as Al Haig would say, I think you need to caveat that. And I think that 1994 was a very skewed Republican turnout. There was a lot of anger at President Clinton in the core Republican conservative base. And so the Republicans are going into 98 with probably they're about as strong as they could be. And a lot of conservatives I talk to worry that they don't have the issues out there that are going to mobilize voters nearly to the extent that they were mobilized in 1994.
Let me suggest something, because that's what I was just thinking of. I mean, in '94, the Republicans, one reason they won was because they were able, through the contract with America, to nationalize the elections. Now, just this week, we have seen President Clinton engage in sort of in-your-face politics with the Congress on this issue of affirmative action. Is it plausible to suggest that that might be an issue that would finally come to a boil probably this spring with the introduction of that Kennedy bill, and would tend to nationalize these elections?
I'm not sure that affirmative action works. First of all, as we've talked about, it depends what you call it. When you call it preferences, you get one result. When you call it affirmative action, it's popular. You looked at this referendum in Houston this year, where a particular wording got on the ballot. The business community said, no, we don't want to get rid of all affirmative action. It would be dangerous for us. I think, yes, you can mobilize some chunk of the electorate against it. I also think it has a counter-mobilization effect for the Democratic base, the black and Hispanic vote, and the Republicans have been losing ground among Hispanics. A lot of Americans are in the middle on this issue. They're ambivalent. They don't like it when you call it quotas, and they don't like it that much when you call it preferences, but they also accept something needs to be done to right historic balances. So I think it's a lot depends on how you play this issue out.
If Democrats are dumb enough to be perceived, to allow themselves to be perceived as defending quotas, I think you could see an apocalyptic election for them. I don't think they're quite that dumb.
Let's take the word preference, because after all, what the subsequent results have shown in California after the institution of Proposition 209 is that, I don't think anybody can disagree with this, with the sharp drop of blacks and Latinos, is that there, in those schools, that there was preference.
But in Texas...
Is that right, EJ? There was preference.
Yeah,
there was. So preference is
affirmative action.
No. Well, but if you use preference, you lose. If you use affirmative action, you win. Now, if the Democrats, if the Republicans can make the case that there was preference, that President Clinton and his Democratic allies are locked into preference, is that an issue that might sort of make this election interesting?
Well, it could. Remember, it could also have a counter effect. It could gin up African American turnout, for example, which might be, even though they're not for preferences, they're much more strongly for affirmative action than whites are. And one of the big problems this year in all the races, New Jersey, New York, Virginia, was terribly low black turnout. So it could have interesting effects. It could help the Republicans in some ways, help the Democrats in others.
In Texas...
We are running out of time. I'm going to go around the room quickly, and let's make believe it's 2 days after election in 1998. What would you be talking about? Who won how much? You got to be quick.
The Democrats gained back some of what they lost in 1994, but the Republicans feel okay.
But do the Republicans keep control of the House, the Senate, the governorships, and stay close in the state legislatures?
If I were to guess right now, I guess they'd hold the House, but I think that there's a good I think that's very much in play.
Charles?
I think it's a wash election, and people already be looking at 2000.
Well, but same question.
Everything stays where it is.
In other words, they hold the House for the third consecutive year.
Governor,
right?
Yeah.
I think they'll hold and possibly gain in state legislatures, and it will be
the
Republicans, and it will be viewed as a moderately Republican year, perhaps a bit better for the Republicans than people thought a year ahead of time.
Okay. Thank you, E.J. Dionne, Larry Sabato, and Charlie Cook, and thank you. For Think Tank, I'm Ben Wattenberg.
We at Think Tank depend on your views to make our show better. Please send your questions and comments to New River Media, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036. Or email us at thinktank@pbs.org. To learn more about Think Tank, visit PBS online at www.pbs.org. And please let us know where you watch Think Tank.
This has been a production of BJW Incorporated in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content.